Happy Friday, everyone. We agree. We're about a third of the way through the quarter almost. I'm really pleased to introduce today's speaker, Professor Adam Millard-Ball. Hopefully I got that sort of right. Who is a professor at UCLA in the Luskin School of Public Affairs, and is also the acting director of the Institute of Transportation Studies at UCLA, which is one of the 3 other ITSs in the UC system that we're partners with. Adam's got a really interesting background that combines economics, geography, and urban planning. And you can really see that in the work that he does, and I think the work we're talking about today. What I love about Adam's work is he asks these really interesting questions and does really cool and clever spatial analysis in addressing this question. And it's all about the use of street space, which is kind of fascination. Kind of pavement space, I guess. Parking in the streets. So yeah, it's important stuff, and it's raises some really interesting questions. So with no further ado, let's welcome Adam, and I'm sure we're going to have some great discussion. Okay.
I'll look to that. And, so what I'd like to talk to you about today is really the interface between transportation policy and urban economics and housing policy. When it comes down to the question, the fact that when we think about living on the streets, that's really synonymous with homelessness, and perhaps in like tents or other makeshift encampments that the most obvious to people passing by. But many people actually live on the streets in a slightly less visible way, in cars and camper vans like this that you see in part of LA, even old school buses. And what I want to try and put to you today is the idea that there's nothing actually wrong with living on the streets inherently. If we just think of streets as public land and this reservoir of space in cities. And some of that land could and I think should be used to house people or to at least shelter people. And so when we think of living on the streets, perhaps the problem is like the lack of services, support, security of tenure, the kind of physical quality of the housing, rather than the problem of like, hey, the streets are not a place where we should be using to provide housing. So what I want to try and lay out for you over the next perhaps 40 minutes or so is a way to rather than evicting unhoused people from where they're living right now as a fact of life in California on the streets, to find ways to turn those streets into adequate shelter and adequate housing. And in the process, make a kind of broader argument about the amount of land that cities, particularly in the US, give over to streets rather than other, I'd argue, more productive urban uses. And so this story is starting with the question of like, how wide should a street actually be? And to think about this from first principles, like what are actually the functions of streets? Like why do we have streets in the first place? Well, the most fundamental for residential streets is its access. Because if you go and get to your lot, then your land basically has no value. Right, but this doesn't need to be a regular street. It could be a shared surface, like a roof. I'll show some images in a moment. And importantly, you don't need that much width of a street to just get to your land, or for a garbage truck or for a moving truck like this to get to your land. 16 feet is accepted standard for alleys, and really that's all you need to get to your land. Well, then what about movement, especially movement of motor vehicles? Well, then 90% plus of residential streets, like who cares? Like there's no through traffic. There's very little traffic on these streets. And so you can get away with perhaps a yield street where you have a single bidirectional lane. If you see a car coming the other way, you back up or you pull over. And here you only need about 12 feet of space, which actually could be in the same 16 feet of width that you need for access. The third function, storage, certainly useful for on-street parking, but also oversupplied in most of the US. And so if you see a street with lots of empty parking spaces, like looking right across the park there, the marginal value of that parking is basically zero, right? There's no demand for this, even if cities are giving it away, as they almost always do, for free. But here the required width, that doesn't even need to be a continuous parking network. The street can widen out and provide parking bays at a key intervals. And then there's any other functions of streets as well, light, air, landscaping, space for kids to play basketball, and that you don't need extra width for that. It can be accommodated within the same way. So all this kind of put together means that you can have a residential street that works perfectly well in just 16 feet of width, especially if you don't have a separate sidewalk, if you have like a woon-up or shared street, these examples from the UK and the Netherlands, where you have a single level surface. And this works perfectly well in cities like Tokyo, where there's access and walking without a dedicated space for cars. And even if you've seen or like read Tales of the City, Anna Madrigal's house in San Francisco doesn't even have a street to it. It has a staircase to it. And those houses go for, I don't know how many millions of dollars right now in San Francisco. And this is basically the only access to that house. But if we need just about 16 feet, that's not what cities think. Or that's not the subdivision planners and the traffic engineers, because pretty much every city in the US has something like this. This is San Jose, the street design standards, and this is San Diego. And by the way, I should clarify, when I'm talking about streets, I'm basically talking shorthand for the entire right of way between property lines. And so even like San Jose is this category of narrow residential streets, which really aren't narrow at all, like they're 40 feet, or I guess they're narrow by comparison. And even some of these minor residential streets, again, these aren't streets that have any traffic. They're basically access functions. They're required to be 50 feet or more. And so then, looking at these subdivision codes, we see the effect in reality that US streets are some of the widest in the world. This is work from the Atlas of Urban Expansion. There's an interactive graphic here. If you go to this website, we can see cities like the US are kind of, so Saudi streets are also really wide, but so are places like Killeen and Cleveland, right at the upper end of this. What's a little faint on the? Can you see the screen, or is it too faint?
The previous slide was better.
I'll make it bigger. Okay, I'll make it bigger. It's still a little faint.
Can you move the mouse off the graph?
Okay, I'm just highlighting the streets. And so places like Tokyo here, they have the average width of streets, not just for narrow streets, the average width of streets in new development is just over 16 feet, 16.4 feet. So that was some broad, like an aggregate look. The Atlas people, they used sample streets and stared at aerial images to measure the dimensions. This part of work I was interested in following up and thinking more comprehensively for like every street in some of the largest counties in the US. How wide are these? And related, how much is the land value that we're locking up under these streets straight away? Let me skim through the methods super quickly. I'm happy to answer questions or talk about this in more detail. But basically, this is a large-scale computational GIS problem. The main input is a tax parcel data, which if you see these residential lots, they look like this. This is the OpenStreetMap road network. And so the challenge is to try and fill in these voids in the parcel data, the white areas, and then assign them to specific streets without double counting. So you create their own polygons or discrete intervals along each street, to dissolve them, and then remove the overlap between the land part, the residential parcels, and the own polygons. And then we get these streets and avoiding overlap at some of the intersections. I mean, it seems kind of trivial looking this, but I was kind of proud of that. And then use that to calculate the width of the right of way, validate it using aerial imagery, and then to each of these polygons assigning the land value. So there's a very nice Federal Reserve data set on the underlying land value for census tracts in the US, and year built based on a data set from Tina, Colorado, University of Colorado, that has a raster for the whole of the US. And I did this for the largest 20 counties. I just had some help from a student in cleaning up the code and actually giving it some better documentation. And if you want to do it yourself, it's online here at this GitHub website.
But Adam, quick question. So you went through all that because the cities themselves don't know how much street area they have.
No, but they don't. I mean, cities usually have streets, GIS data layers, but they're almost always as lines.
Yeah.
And they're very exceptionally there as polygons. And so if you want to know how wide a street is and that the lines are not much use, yeah. You can calculate the length, but not the width. But we actually use the OpenStreetMap data set just because it's more, you don't have to go city by city and look for streets.
Did you encounter a lot of situations during this conversion where you discovered that a street that was assumed to be public actually ended up being privately owned? And I've seen it where sometimes cities think that it is a public street, but it's actually a public right-of-way over a piece of private land. Have you encountered that a lot?
Yeah, I think that the main good area where we saw that, and this is what the data don't cover, is HOAs. And so where the street rights of ways are like owned by the homeowners association, and technically it's a taxable lot as far as the county assessor is concerned. But then that's also like any common area in the HOA, whether it's a park or a street. And so with this method, it doesn't really apply to HOAs very well. So there might be a few other situations, but that's certainly the main situation where that arises. So these are all public streets we were talking about, not the ones that are maintained by HOAs, which is less an issue in California, but in places like Arizona, particularly that's where I noticed it the most. So what are some of the key findings here? So these are for the 20 largest the US counties. The data sets are county by counties, and you get some. Yeah, and so this is the interactive version of that chart. So if we want to look at somewhere like Maricopa County, then more than 2/3 of the street rights of way are exactly 50 feet wide, or to the nearest foot. And that's even with the inaccuracies inherent in this method. They're building to this 50-foot standard. And so that's perhaps the most extreme one, but even in somewhere like Chicago and Cook County, this was surprising. Why are they all 66 feet wide? And it turns out that they're historically they had a physical surveyor's chain to map out the subdivisions, and that chain was 66 foot long. And so they said, okay, our streets are going to be 66 feet wide. And they still are today. That's still in the county's subdivision code. And so pretty much every county you go to, most counties, and they have this heavily peaked kind of nodal distribution. And even in somewhere like Miami, where you think, okay, this is what you might expect if these are organic decisions by thousands of individual developers, that might have been the case in the start. In Miami. But if you look at, say, recently built streets, say, since the 1980s, then they get more and more concentrated, this 50-foot right of way limit constructed streets. So here we see like a really compelling evidence that these subdivision rules and street design standards, that they're binding, right? They're being followed to the, if not to the inch, then to the foot by the developers. And from an economic perspective, well, is this too wide? Well, that depends on the opportunity cost, right? It depends what we could be doing if we didn't put this land on the streets. What's the opportunity cost of that land? So let's look at an example. So this is a typical house in like central San Jose, a typical starter house, I guess, for people in Silicon Valley. As you've got to spare like 2.8 million, then it's yours. But when you buy that house, you're also paying for, it's on your side of the street, 50 foot of street width. Again, remember the access requires only 16 feet or 8 on your side of the street. So what does that mean in dollar terms? But it means that for this type of parcel, more than $200,000 of just the land value. This isn't talking about the asphalt, the construction costs at all. This is just the land value. If we use that for housing, that land would go for more than $200,000. But as a street, the marginal value is basically $0 because most of it is useless asphalt or like counterproductive asphalt that's contributing to stormwater challenges because the parking on a street like this is almost never fully occupied. So the margin on that street is too wide. So how does this filter back to the housing market? Well, there's the land cost, so that is needed to bundle the street into the housing, but also the regional scale are also constraining supply. If we're requiring these wide streets and we're reducing for a given density the amount of housing that can be built. To put it another way, this is also San Jose. So per square foot, the land value of this house is about $133 per square foot. Not the structure, not the improvements, just the raw land if you've got to put an empty lot. And the city gives this bit of land away for free. Right? It doesn't charge you to drive on it. The city, it's free to all comers. And then you can park there. You need a residential permit if you want to park overnight. But if you figure out the present value per square foot of that residential permit, it's under $4. So there's this huge differential between the land that's under housing, $133, and the land that's on the street, where the marginal value is 0 or very close to 0. Let's go scaling this up. If we add up for all these 20 countries, this is the total on the left, and this is per housing unit on the right. We get nearly $1 trillion of land value locked up under just the residential streets. So this is not the arterials, this is not the freeways, this is only local streets. And I chose my examples in San Jose because this bar here, the tallest one is Santa Clara County, so San Jose in Silicon Valley. And the purple bit is the residential streets, a housing unit nearly on average, not the extremes, but on average, nearly $150,000 of land value per unit. And then you can basically double that if you take into account the arterials and the other streets. And so these California counties that have this kind of toxic combination of wide-ish streets, but also really high land values and relatively low densities creates this, because you have a lot of land that's not being, the streets that's not being shared by very many units on the street. Whereas if you go somewhere like Kings County, New York, that's this bar here, that's basically Brooklyn, then the street's still really valuable and the street's pretty wide. But if you have low-rise apartment buildings on the street, then that space is being divided up between many more households. And so the impact on housing costs is going to be much less. So I'm going to come back to the housing angle in just a moment. I'm going to take a little bit of detour to, this is kind of in progress, almost off the presses. Some work on, well, what's the downside of these wide streets to urban heat? And so this is a project with Ruth Engel and Kelly Turner at UCLA. Because wide streets, again, focusing here on the housing, but there's also the consequences in kind of the discourse for urban heat. So cities like LA, like doing cool streets programs, like literally using light-colored surfaces or like light-colored paint to resurface the streets. So the albedo of these streets is getting larger. And urban heat offices or programs in places like Melbourne and in Australia, really kind of zeroing in on the streets as places that are making urban heat worse, particularly detrimental for pedestrians or people waiting for the buses without shade, but also in an ambient sense, increasing the heat of urban neighborhoods, at least so the story goes. So we're trying to think out like, hey, what is the contribution of wide streets to urban heat in Southern California? We're using land surface temperature satellites measured. The warmer areas are yellowish. This is degrees C, so 62 degrees Celsius here. And then the cool areas, these are mainly the mountains. This is the Hollywood Hills, the mountains of Malibu, or right down by the coast. When you really see the deserts, the kind of Antelope Valley up in the top of the picture, this is where the land surface, the desert, is really hot. And also the gradient as you go east into Riverside County. So I should have colored it blue, but this is Pacific. This is the Pacific Ocean over here. So our findings, and we kind of stared at like so many examples because we couldn't get our heads around it. But we actually found that some of the coolest parts of these counties are actually streets. Especially freeways. So this is good news if you love freeways, I guess, like a freeway engineer. Perhaps partly because the light-colored pavement. And so that's especially true in places like, this is a great example from Chino Hills, where the hotspot here, in terms of high land surface temperatures, the streets, it's basically these large footprint buildings, like often industrial and in some cases large apartment complex. And the streets, often you see, especially the wider streets and not just freeways, they're painting this kind of ribbon of cooler land surface temperatures throughout the county. And so I get qualitative conclusion, and they'll show you some of the quantitative results in a moment, was first of all, the problem isn't really streets, it's parking lots and big box buildings. Like black asphalt is a lot worse for land surface temperature than the lighter, especially in Southern California, they're often concrete paved and they're lighter colored streets. But more than that, vegetation is such a dominant influence on land surface temperature that streets really are a rounding error if that. And so these examples, so the all urban areas from the top left, colors are a little washed out on the projector. They basically have like vegetation, so measure vegetation savvy on the y-axis, and the average width of streets in that pixel on the x-axis, and then temperature is the heat map, the color ramp. So you can see in, I haven't got long enough, I'm not tall enough, but if I could point, as you see a really strong gradient with vegetation. And if you have more vegetated areas, then you have cooler temperatures, the greens and blues in the chart, and areas that are not vegetated are the oranges and red, the really high temperatures. But then again, on the y dimension, there's almost no there's zero relationship. And so that's, a regression analysis confirms this. There's basically zero relationship between how wide a street is and average land surface temperature, at least in Southern California. And this is true, especially in industrial areas, or in cities that tend to have more industrial or kind of big box or large footprint buildings. So Colton, low income, somewhat industrial community in San Bernardino County. Consider the green, these are like pixels with no roads. And then the residential and arterial pixels are basically the same. And then highways are slightly cooler. And the only place you see the opposite is places like Pacific Palisades, like one of the, if not the most wealthy community, where these neuropixels, so basically people's like large yards with lots of trees and everything like that. So that's the only case in which streets tend to be warmer. So that's not an argument in my book to like make streets wider, but it does suggest a cautionary tale that, hey, this isn't a quick win. Like, this isn't the easy way to make cities cooler through narrowing streets or through going and like painting cool services. It might be a nice ribbon cutting opportunity, but it's not getting at the fundamental problem of urban heat in these places. So in the last part, in the last part, I want to turn back to housing and think, okay, if I convince you, perhaps in an abstract way, like we better to use this land for housing rather than for the streets, how can we make that happen in practice? And the starting point is to recognize that this is already happening, right? And that's the kind of reality in California, where this is LA, like people living in camper vans on the street. And if you've seen the Dame Maggie Smith, I was going to play that. Okay. Oh, never mind. Okay, I won't go through it. Okay, so that was, all right, there we go. So if you've seen, has anyone seen this movie? It's really cute. Dame Maggie Smith. It's a true story by by Alan Bennett, and so she like parks her van and lives in it on the street in London, and then finally like Alan Bennett takes pity on her and she goes and parks on his driveway, and he can't get rid of her for the next 15 years. And she's somewhat of a hoarder as well. So that's the true story. And so this is a reality right now, for that matter in London as well as California. And so many cities, they either selectively enforce overnight parking restrictions or like resident parking restrictions, or kind of turn a blind eye to violations, especially in industrial and non-residential neighborhoods. And so that's fine, but it's really not giving residents like any security of tenure, doesn't give them any access to water or sanitation or other services, or even simple things like getting mail. But cities have recognized this off the street. Right? They've places like Berkeley, they've designated like some empty lots as safe parking zones on off-street sites, or allowed people to build like tiny homes, or allowed residents to build like tiny homes in their backyards. But we're never going to, that's never going to scale, right? There's only a small amount of surplus publicly owned off-street sites, whereas streets are a far larger source of surplus lands. So why not do this on streets, like lease out street spaces, or at least allows residents to use this, provide some key services, and that's provide some security of tenure, whether vans or even in tiny houses. Again, this is a reflection of this is a reality that already exists, but just in a much more precarious nature. This is an LA Times story last week about UC students who are living in cars and trying to go to class and study while living in cars on the streets, or in this case, a camper van. This is actually a student, Matthew Chin, from my old department at UC Santa Cruz in environmental studies, where he was literally camping in the forest, had all his stuff stolen, like when he went to class, and then ended up living in a van on a leased, but illegal lease of someone's driveway. So that's one step to kind of mobile ADUs, right, is to kind of legalize this practice and formalize this this approach for people who are living in vans. And one might seem a bit of an aside, but this is actually how I became interested in this topic in the first place. was through some work on autonomous vehicles. Because if we're thinking about, well, the goal is perhaps to blur the boundaries between what land is used for streets and what land is used for everything that's not street, so like housing and commercial and so on. Autonomous vehicles perhaps have the promise of blurring these lines, especially between land that's dedicated to parking and land that is dedicated to movement on streets. But right now, it's pretty easy for traffic engineers to draw that distinction. Like, hey, if you're parked, you have to pay the meter. You can't leave your car unattended in certain places. But if you're an autonomous car, these simulations I did basically show how it's optimal for autonomous cars to basically create this like lazy river of themselves through either through coordination or just through choosing the most congested street. Because if you're stuck in traffic, you basically can park for free as an autonomous vehicle. And if you want to get stuck in traffic, well, then create your own traffic. And by just turning onto the most congested road at each intersection. And so the calculations, this is a little simulation that a micro simulation in San Francisco figured out that with some assumptions on like electrification, this could cost, you could quote unquote park for less than 50 cents an hour quite easily as an autonomous vehicle, including wear and tear, including electricity and so on. And so one point here is that autonomous vehicles can blur the line between land that's used for parking and land that's used for through movement. But then you take that a step further and, well, can they actually blur the line between land that's used for living and land that's used for driving and parking? If you have an autonomous camper van, well, then it's a really great way to obey like overnight parking restrictions. And you can just like move according to the time limits, or just drive around and try and get yourself stuck in traffic in a lazy river of other autonomous camper vans. I guess UC Davis is still expensive to live, but the coastal campus of Santa Barbara, Santa Cruz, LA, I can imagine like students driving around campuses because there's no housing for them at an affordable price that the university can provide. Right. So one analogy I want to draw is that some places already do this for surplus transportation infrastructure. I grew up in, it's very obvious, in England, and the liveaboards or canal boats are actually a relatively low-cost housing option for people in East London, in Oxford, and in other cities. So there's kind of communities of canal boat dwellers on infrastructure that was originally to like carry goods around England. And so this analogy is kind of further. This is summed up by UC Santa Cruz student, an MFA student, Aaron Singley, that I worked with. We have people living on liveaboards, so we can imagine the same sort of idea of like devoting surplus street right of way to housing for people who want to have low cost or more temporary housing option. Perhaps the spots are let on a yearly basis by the city. And importantly, some basic services provided, like sanitation, garbage, and so on. On the long term, I'm not going to dwell on this because this is perhaps the obvious answer, right? Is to just reduce street web standards in subdivision codes. And so legalize places like these narrow streets that you find in, say, some parts of Pennsylvania. So we've had this argument in California, like as of last week, it seems like we've won that argument on minimum parking requirements. Like, why should cities dictate to developers, like how many parking spaces they need to provide in each housing unit? We still do it for streets, right? We say that, hey, you need to have a 40 or a 50 or a 60-foot street right away if you want to build this subdivision. But from an economic point of view, all the benefits of the streets, or almost all of them, if there's no through traffic, are internalized by people who are living in that neighborhood. So at least in principle, you might say that developers are really well placed to make that trade-off. And they have to sell these units they're building, but why not let them decide, just as we can now let them decide how many parking spaces to build, and let them decide how wide the streets in this neighborhood are going to be. And if you're worried that this is a giveaway to developers, well, there's perhaps more productive public benefits that you can ask developers for in lieu of wide streets. What about existing streets? So these are kind of the tougher nut to crack, right? But here you can think about, well, what about as part of redevelopment, expanding residential lots into this surplus street space? And just piggybacking on some ideas that I think as Jamie Folker and Calvin Thigpen were developing here at Davis. I didn't see you. I never do yet. Okay.
Calvin's online.
Oh, hi, Calvin. Yeah. And or perhaps because there's utilities in the street, then have landscaping form a street right away, provide a function that was previously provided by the setback, so just allow people to build new ADUs in their front yard. And people like Nando, my colleague at UCLA, have talked about that kind of reverse process, whereas the city requires developers to widen streets. So you get these weirdly irregular streets that widen out when a new building was constructed, and then narrow back down again. So why not do the opposite, right? If developers can be asked to cede land when they build something, why not allow them to reclaim land if they build a new apartment building, especially if they're paying the cost of moving curbs and things like that. This is also some work with Aaron Single. We can just look at this as a simple version, a prototype in somewhere like San Jose, that we can, went too fast, that we can kind of build more ADUs or garage conversions or something like that in the front, in the front, what's now the front Simback, and then use the former street right of way, which is here, to have some pockets for parking, some landscaping, basically replicating the function of this front setback and providing privacy and screening, and perhaps in some cases some on-street parking, particularly for the guests as well. So what I want to summarize, in addition to these specific points of streets are wide, they're pushing up the cost of housing, perhaps we can turn streets into housing. So I really want to emphasize this large point, this last point, particularly in an audience of transportation people. But I try to say this nicely. I think we kind of get too defensive about land for transportation infrastructure, and think that okay, this land, this street, this has to be for transportation. We need to safeguard it, right? And so there's some amazing work on even on road diets and by urban designers, but they're keeping the right of way the same width, just dividing out differently, perhaps adding much wider bike lanes and some landscaping, perhaps more bioswales or things like that. So this work is great in terms of rethinking within this fixed right of way what we can do much more creatively than we do right now. There's nobody questioning the fundamental premise of why does a street right of way even have to be this wide in the first place. And so I don't think there's a good reason for this land for transportation to be sacrosanct and can only ever more be used for transportation. And we should start to think of ways to kind of fudge these boundaries between land that's used for transportation, and rather than the cities are doing right now, trying to kind of evict people who are living on streets in tents or in cars, rather than trying to stop unhoused people using the streets that way, try and think more creatively about how we can turn street land area into housing. So thanks very much for the chance to talk about this, and I look forward to questions and comments and ideas. Before questions, so the visualization, so just show this website, you can find out more about my work at this website here. And thanks so much to the funders of the California, and again to Aaron, who did these lovely sketches, and to Theodore Loud, who actually cleaned up the code and documented it, so it's going to be usable by other people, not just myself.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I had a question. So you've kind of gone into this geospatial analysis of our American cities and how we could kind of densify those to help with homelessness. I was wondering what, if you were to make a policy or recommendation on the state level, right? Because obviously we also have to deal with things like Proposition 13, people hoarding properties because it's in California very, it's an incentive to hold on to property. How would you kind of rebalance this inequity in housing aside from the geospatial issue on a policy level? What would you recommend happen in order for this to start making change? For example, here in Davis, we have some areas that could be developed. The PG&E side being this beautiful example of an empty abandoned lot, but due to the ownership extending so long back in history, it's kind of incentivizing the current owner to keep holding on to that property to make money. What would your recommendation be to solve some of those issues that we have?
So the state level, so in California at least, this is mainly city and county subdivision ordinances. And then in some places like Texas, I believe, actually has state legislation about the minimum width of, or the street right of way width for residential streets. So in places where that's a big constraint, but certainly there's a state policy issue to like, hey, like there's that local control over streets and maybe voting as well and stuff like that when they're at it. But in California, you can think of it at least partly as a city and county level effort, and maybe that's a place to start. And perhaps in the medium term, there might be a role for state legislation in the same way as there was for minimum parking requirements, right? But some cities did it on their own free will, on their own volition, but really not many of them. Like got rid of minimum parking requirements. Took Laura Friedman's. Assemblymember Friedman's legislation, which was signed I think last week, to really tell cities like, hey, the state is telling you you can't do this. So maybe we'll get to that point with streets as well, but I think that's better in the future. So that's on the street widths and on new construction. And then for the kind of turning streets into housing, I mean, that's really a local level issue, and it's kind of giving incentives to property owners, like say, hey, like ADUs have been widely successful in California because they've aligned with the interests of people who own the property. Like, hey, I can build an ADU.
Can you explain ADU?
Oh, sorry, yeah, sorry, I've heard this. Yeah, so accessory dwelling units. So like a backyard cottage, maybe about the garage that you could either rent out or kind of have family members living in there, like kids who won't leave home, leave home, like parents who won't leave home, and that's been hugely successful because people want to do it. If people want to build this, they can expand their living space or rent it out, and so I think that's really the mechanism to make this happen, is to align it with people like saying, yeah, I want to build on my front setback.
So who would you envision kind of maintain these or own these spaces? One of my issues, and I've worked in architecture with ADUs, is that we're kind of incentivizing people who already own properties. So as a present, we're allowing them to build, more dwelling units on their property, giving them kind of a clear way to build without a permit, and that's a substandard type of housing that people can then rent at a really high rate. And I was thinking about this, your story is really compelling. We're wasting a lot of space, but in terms of who owns it and who maintains it, I was wondering how you see that kind of public space that we would then use for housing. Who would kind of take charge of that from the monetary side?
Yeah, so there's different models. So if it's on someone's property, then obviously they maintain it, and there's kind of building codes that apply to ADUs right now. It's not that you can build something that's seismically unsafe or is or a fire trap. But also, I think it's also like not letting the perfect housing being the kind of goal when like we can offer like measurable improvements to people who are sleeping in cars right now. And so in terms of the management of, let's say, legalized parking, then that could be in the same system as the kind of safe parking off-street sites. But also it's kind of working right now, but we don't see it because it's dispersed. And I've talked to many of my students who are like, oh yeah, I've been living in a van and I'm the only one on the street. I know a couple of the neighbors or like they're friends of mine and they go and use their bathroom and their garbage and it's fine. Like it works out well without anyone needing to get involved except just making it, like, preventing the kind of the police harassment, which then leads to like discriminatory enforcement. If you have a tidy looking van, you get moved on. If you have a nice Mercedes Sprinter van, you don't. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think parking minimums have incentivized single-family homes instead of multi-family homes? And also, like, how do you think maybe cities could promote multi-family units and maybe in parking spaces, like using parking lots to build multi-family units instead of single-family?
I mean, I think we have an experiment in California where we're just going to see like how much parking did like stop multifamily development being built. But the paper I love is to my colleagues like Paula Monken and Mike Manville at UCLA. They talk about the regulatory hydra. Where there's like so many regulations in California that make it really difficult to build multifamily, whether it's setbacks or like height limits or parking requirements or who knows what else. And so you cut off one head of this hydra, you're still not going to build apartments in Atherton tomorrow, like the wealthiest zip code, I think, in the wealthiest city in California. And so it's definitely like really important, but it's necessary but not sufficient, I'd say. But there's a lot of evidence of parking requirements. If for a flat number of spaces per unit, they basically push developers to build larger and more expensive luxury units because they can amortize the cost of the parking over a larger amount of livable space.
This is very thought-provoking. I just wanted to get an understanding more quantitatively of what you meant by the street. Does that include the sidewalk and the space in between the sidewalk and the street? Because that seems like a huge difference in space then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of use streets because it's cumbersome to say right away every single time. It's nice shorthand. But basically, when I'm talking about the width and the value, it's basically from property line to property line. So including sidewalks, like landscaping, buffers, as well as the road surface. And so, typical 50-foot right of way, that's I think that's like 10 foot of sidewalk and 5 foot each side and 8 foot of parking lane each side, and then 12 foot of 2 driving lanes. And I think that adds up to 50. Okay, thank you. Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Great presentation, and I totally agree with your conclusions, but I have some problem with the methods of getting there.
Okay.
I think it will be really, really important to think what are the positive factors of wide streets or streets in general, and then start to find a way to solve the things why we'll narrow our streets. And one of these projects that Susan and I never published, which was great, is counting basketball hoops in streets in Davis and thinking about them as playgrounds for the neighbors and thinking about them as a way for privacy, so I can keep my windows open instead of the AC and have a discussion without the neighbors interfering in my discussion. and think about it as I can have more than 2 guests without coordinating where they will park. And so all of this one by one, thinking about all of these things that because of them, we want our streets to be wide and find the ways around them in order to get to exactly the same conclusion that I'd like us to get, that we can manage with probably half the. But right now, I think that you kind of brush it all. Oh, that's zero value to have parking, zero value to have streets, and I think that it's way more than that.
Well, I think there's an important distinction. There's zero value at the margin, right? Because we have like more land in the streets than like you can play all the basketball games you want on them, and you'll still have lots of space left over. So it's not that these uses don't have any value, but just that we have so much that at the margin we can take like that marginal square foot of like street space away, and we wouldn't lose anything at all. And again, it's not that on-street parking has no value, but we just have so much of it that it's 10% occupied, plus 20% occupied as a rule of thumb, and there are many suburban subdivisions. And so the point is not that every street right away has to be like 16 feet and only 16 feet wide. It's that, well, that's the minimum, and maybe, especially where land is cheap, yeah, sure, you can build a little wider than that. But it's not the city or the county that should be telling people that. Like, I mean, we just got rid of parking requirements. We don't need minimum basketball hoop requirements for the streets, right? To make sure that each new neighborhood has enough space to kids to play streets in the basketball. Like,
let's take 20 parking slots and actually make a city-owned nice basketball. But we need to think about all of this, what the street is doing for us, and then replace it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The streets have lots of functions, but these functions are like can easily be accommodated like in like streets that are far narrower than the ones we have today. Karen.
So bridging off of this, everything you said was fantastic until the very end in my mind. As someone who actually works in the use of street space for transportation purposes, what I'll say is that contiguous corridors is the reason why this is sort of kept as sacred space often. And it's because when we eventually want to put a bus lane or a transit facility of some sort or bike facilities, because the street has gotten busy enough that we feel we have to be separating out modes because there's inherent safety issues there. If we don't, then we need to have that space available, because often in places where it wasn't available, we're now in huge arguments over how that street space is used. And I think we have more of those than the opposite, right? I think in residential streets, what you're saying makes sense, but oftentimes we kind of don't know how a street is going to convert over time. So I guess what I would encourage is that maybe it's not thought of like similar to what others said about like the property owner owning this additional land or something like that. You're sort of, you know, as one of those wealthy landowners, this sounds great, right? I get to take over part of the street to build a new ADU on my property that I'm going to benefit for. But if we also think a little bit more European or Asian about the ownership of this land, that people are allowed to be using this space for some period of time, but the ownership of it remains so that we still have these contiguous transportation corridors, that if we do need the space, we can have it back. Because one of our critical failures in the US is that all of our land is privately owned. And so when we need to do so, we no longer have the ability to take these pieces back.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. But I think that's a subset of the streets. And what I'm talking about really is the residential streets that are maybe at some point if they're not like a gated subdivision, then they might become a through corridor for perhaps bikes. But they're not going to, it's not going to be a bus rapid transit line on these streets in like the next 500 years. This is not an argument for narrowing like every arterial where we might need that space for these types of transit projects or protected bike lanes. Talking about the types of streets that have such low traffic volumes that you don't need bike lanes. You don't even need a sidewalk, perhaps. You can have a shared surface, but that's not an argument that applies to most arterials. So yeah, absolutely. And I think doing your work in like 20 years ago, right, about street connectivity, that so much of our residential subdivisions are kind of locked up in places that by design can never be that contiguous corridor because there's just one way in or two ways in and out. And so those are the streets that are really the kind of number one target for this type of intervention, because yeah, you're never going to build a bus rapid transit line into like a gated community. Yeah. Who is next? I've lost track. Okay.
Let's start students. Okay, thank you. You got on fun. I love this. I think there's a possibility of convergence with transportation, right? With land use. For multimodal, I think this goes great with the possibility of having walkways, and you can like speedily walk to the next subway, train, BRT, bike. So like, yes to all. My question is regarding come from Mexico City. So people build more, and what gets lost is people will fight for the streets, and people will fight for their profit and need for space for, you know, a very dense urban areas, and most cities in the world are just going to grow. The trees are the ones that are going. So what you get is there'll be more buildings all the way to the curb. So I don't know if there's any thought that eventually we have like no green at all.
Yes. Yeah. Again, it's not a. It's not that trees are like trees, just like basketball hoops are good as well. But we can easily. There's plenty of space for trees within a narrower right of way, and it doesn't have to, just as the street can widen out occasionally for like pockets of on-street parking, it can widen out for like pockets of trees or tree wells and so on. We don't need to have like a continuous 50-foot strip of like right of way in order to accommodate street trees. So
as a quick follow-up, sign trip, is there already maybe a ratio that exists for a local, like this is how much, you know, green versus residential versus transportation in this new narrower version or intention of?
No, and I'd be reluctant to say that, because I think it's also an urban design question, right? And it's kind of context specific. It depends on how it relates to the buildings that are off the street. But if you have a large front setback with a single family home, you don't need extra trees on the street in the front yard. Whereas if you have like taller apartment buildings that are like with no setback, then sure, like have a little wider right of way with some greenery, at least in parts. But that's but it doesn't. That's kind of opposite argument for like say having a continuous, like the street must be 50 foot wide at all points along the or this right of way must be 50 foot wide and all points along this corridor. And sure, one thing I meant to say partly in that, but also in response to Kerry's point, was that like learning a lot from a couple of students about Japanese planning, which I'm not an expert on and never been, but I've been struck by their like real distinguishing between like the arterials and like which streets have a through transportation function, where they're much more, the city is much more engaged in like planning and like for the reserve right of way and so on, and like make sure there's capacity. And then the local access streets, which they just, there's no standards, that's why they build like streets that are on average 16 feet wide. That's what I understand. Were you keeping track, Susan?
No, not really, but let's do another student down here.
I was wondering,
And then Dylan.
I was wondering if you see this applying to new construction or like areas that like have already been built in streetless instead, because when it's new construction, often the streets can become very congested with, there's building material on the streets, lumber, stones, contractors need to park, there's trucks that need to get through, there's food vendors that need to get through, contractors. I was wondering if you have any like ways you can kind of suggest how that would be handled, like during the construction phase, if you propose narrowing the streets.
So if in new, especially in new subdivisions, I mean, that's much simpler, right? There's staging areas on the, actually on the lots themselves. And it's much easier to kind of narrow the street rights away or let the developer to decide when going forward. In existing urban areas, it's messier, but we don't need to size streets for the kind of like once in 100 years when like 2 buildings are being constructed and there's a street market and kids want to play basketball and there's something else going on. We can figure that out. We can close streets like occasionally, like if there's construction going on, and let people like walk around. And that's what many other countries do. They don't, there's not this mentality like we have to keep the street open at all costs with like motor vehicle access right to everyone's front door. Like, yeah, sure, if there's like a big construction project, then close the street if you need that space for like a week or even a few weeks for construction. And that's, at least that's been my experience in like growing up in England. That's not that uncommon. You can put 16 feet of right away is plenty of room to put a dumpster and run a garbage truck, run a big moving truck through as well. And also, especially if there's more resilience in the street network, that it's a connected grid or like otherwise grid or some other connected form of streets, so that not there's alternate ways for the fire department or for the garbage people to get to a specific property.
Dylan, you can.
I want to just get your thoughts on overcoming like NIMBY opposition or something like this, because I think I love the idea, but if I like put myself in a property owner situation and all of a sudden the city said camper vans can park in front of my house, I can just see, I mean, you put a bike lane in, a protected bike lane in on a minor arterial in coastal Los Angeles, and the neighbors freak out so much so that council members are about to lose their seats, so they have to rip it out, right? And that's the kind of thing that we see. So now we're talking about housing in residential districts. Seems like a big hill to climb over, but I'm sure you've got some thoughts.
So partly I think it's you're all too nice to me. Like every time I like mention this idea to like friends or like family, like my brother's partner, my partner's brother was like, you're crazy, like don't you dare do this. So you're absolutely right. But I think partly it's a case of really, but this happens already. Like, I mean, like, but it's just under the radar partly because of the way parking restrictions, like especially overnight parking restrictions, are enforced in a really discriminatory way. So if you're black or brown, or the teddy van, like the police are like on your, they've got their, yep, 72 hours is almost up, they're like ready to give you a ticket. And whereas if you kind of like know someone, if you like a friend of or a family member of some of the neighbors, you get a much easier ride. So I think part of it is like reducing, I don't know whether that's statewide legislation or something else, kind of restrict the ability to do that, or to like, at least the first step is to allow people to like have camper vans in their driveways, and the state did that with ADUs, and people eventually realized that the sky wasn't falling in. And that it wasn't like, it's not that like every house on the street is going to have a camper van in it, right? If we stop concentrating on the issue, then okay, your neighbor has a van and there's a student or a family member who are living in it. It seems much less of a problem, just as like the sky didn't fall in with ADUs, which people had many different objections, I think, before they realized, yeah, you know, actually it's fine. So that kind of political transition, like, yeah, I don't know, but
and it's, I mean, it's a good point, because I see cities do this where like they'll designate not a residential street, but a street that's like, say, in a commercial district that is just quiet at night, or on the periphery of the city, and they say, okay, we'll let you park your vans here. And then it becomes like they basically created a little community. And it has less, there's not as much outrage because it's not in front of current dwellers.
Yeah, and I think your point about if one of your slides showed that property owner would have the opportunity to reclaim some of that street space. I mean, that seems to me, I mean, it's problematic in equity ways potentially, but I think that helps with the NIMBY thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I want to get to another practical issue, which is, okay, so every night I bike home on this street that is a perfect candidate for this. Way too wide, it's.
Yes, but I'm
never
gonna
needed to be
benefit when
that
that very street is the one that we do this on.
What's up? Anyway, and then one side of the street, it's actually the sides of houses because of the layout of the network. So it wouldn't even mean like taking front yards, people could expand. So I think I've thought about that, ooh, you could fit like a half a lot. There's a half a lot width going up and down the street. But if it were the property. But what about the practical matter of drainage and utilities? And it can't just, that's a huge practical limitation.
Yeah, and so that's the reason. So if you these are a little washed out on the projectors, but the idea is that you're not necessarily building in the street right away right now. So you are basically building into the front setback where there's not going to be utilities and drainage as much. And so if you have, like, say, sewers going underneath what's now a sidewalk, then you can maintain access through just basically landscaping those and perhaps like parking pockets and other stuff. And so you're like not building in the actual street right away, which maybe there's internet or border lines that are going under there, and you're just it doesn't need to be asphalt.
I mean, utilities aren't everywhere. You can avoid the utility lines.
Yeah, but they're under, well, I can just see, it's always, but the drainage too, like your whole drainage system, you're moving curves. Maybe my particular example would be especially complicated.
But I think it also, if you're like in LA, where you have to like widen the street right now, if you want to build like a 10-unit apartment building, you still have to pay to move the curbs and drainage with that. So you can pay, it's worth your while. If you get an extra unit or two, it's probably worth your while as a developer to move the sewer or definitely to move the curbs, which you probably have to. I mean, often if you're doing a major redevelopment, you have to rebuild the sidewalk anyway as part of that kind of improvement.
I had a question more about the stigma around these way of living, because there's a difference between what they're marketing for tiny homes versus the mobile homes parking spaces, and also part of why maybe people don't want to allow people to park in these vans in front of them is more the stigma around these, the people that have been more in mobile homes, which is just the same as a tiny house, but the whole thing around that and all these tiny house movement, there's also a whole discussions, there's discussion groups and where you should go to park it because it's more better people than the other. So how to do this and allow people to say, okay, you can park here when there's already this stigma about who lives in mobile homes.
Yeah, I mean, it's related to Dylan's question, right? There is that stigma, and politically it's hard, and I think the step by step and legalizing the driveway parking, where a person by definition is going to have a connection to the property owner or resident, and maybe negotiate some sort of bathroom access and garbage as well. That's the kind of the lowest hanging fruit, and then the next step is hey, maybe you can you have permits that people who live on that street can get out to their friends or family members to live there, and then gradually scale it up. But I think it's, if you just do this, I agree. If you do this overnight citywide straight away, then there'll be a backlash.
But also thinking on Dylan's point, he's suggesting that maybe there should be areas allowed for this, but they turn to be areas outside, in the border of the city. where nobody wants to see them. So again, you're promoting this, like, this is for the ones who cannot do anything else. So, you know, shouldn't there be like more like downtown, better connected, nice area for these people and these connections, instead of like you go to the border of the city where nobody can see.
Yeah, absolutely. There's more opportunity for our services, water and stuff like that.
Sort of based off of this last wave of discussion, how can we improve safety for people who are living on the street like this? You know, both in terms of theft, traffic collisions, and of course, as you mentioned, police discrimination.
Yeah, that's a good question. I have to say I don't have a good answer to that, other than that I think that the first step is to, by formalizing or legalize it, at least you take away the ability of the kind of police to like be like hovering, like which I've heard from students this happens, that hovering outside a van, like waiting for the 72 hours to be up so they can write a ticket. And so and neighbors aren't able to call the like local parking people or police department to have people moved on. I think that's the first step of it, how you address the broader social prejudice against unhoused people. Yeah, that's above my pay grade.
I'm doing on top of that. I know that in certain places in LA, like they have homeless people live in their cars, and mostly like teenagers or adults, and so they assign certain parking lots so people can park there at night, and they provide like extra security, like people just kind of monitors the place and has some cameras, like restrooms and stuff. So that kind of helps with people safety part, but also like does these kinds of movements or like decision helps on the situation on the streets, or like because this this solution may be a good way to solve the problem with the people living on the street, but also I'm not exactly sure. You probably mentioned this during your presentation. What is the main goal of trying to shrink down the streets, or just removing people off the streets? Is that what you're trying to get to?
So the main goal is just this better use of this urban land, which is really valuable than having it as unused asphalt. And so in California, like the pressing priority is housing. But I mean, that's in other places. Maybe there's other local priorities for that use of the space. And then with the safe parking lots, I mean, that's definitely a kind of a good starting point. What I hear from the challenge of that is that people get kicked off during the day. So it's a place to park at night, but then like you're constantly like forced to be on the move. Like you have to leave by like 8 o'clock or something, or 7 o'clock in the morning. And so it doesn't do give that stability and the people to make a home there.
So we're getting short on time, maybe 3 more questions.
Somebody who hasn't.
Okay.
I think there's kind of an interesting parallel in your presentation with the changes that happened with parking space during the pandemic. But I think my question kind of more aligns with what Dylan was getting at regarding kind of NIMBYism, and more so like even on an individual street level. Let's say I live in a street and there are 2 or 3 property owners that want to use this street space that's now allocated to them, but maybe other members of the street don't want that space to be used in that way. I just kind of see a conflicting set of interests, even though obviously we all think that we own the street, whether it's outside of our house or 1,000 yards down, we still kind of collectively see it that way. So I just kind of imagine, from a practical standpoint, trying to cede public land to private individuals, or even to the public, even ceding that land to say, okay, now we'll let the city decide what to do with this. I just see that might be problematic from the landowner's perspective, thinking about the way that they conceive this ownership versus the way the ownership is actually considered. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so I'll try to be quick so you can get some more questions. And the first thing I should actually emphasize is in many cases, the city doesn't actually own the street right of way. So land use law is complicated, but I think in many cases it's an easement that the city has rather than owning the land and the street in fee simple. So the property owners actually it's part of that parcel. But yeah, there's I think having that competition of a street space is a nice problem to have, right? It shows there's like demand to use it for something more more productive. But that's why we have planning processes, whether it's at the kind of individual block level and or the community scale. And I think it's not really a one size fits all answer to like how to manage those competing visions for like how your street should look like. But that's why we have planners. That's
Sit back there.
so.
I was thinking about the evacuation plans. I think it needs to be reevaluated again, and probably some of these narrower streets can lead to bottlenecks later on. So one of my questions is, let's say there are two parallel streets, both of them are wide, and we realize that we want to keep one of them as wide for some kind of evacuation during hurricane, fire. How do we decide which one? Because the one which becomes narrower is like giving gifts to all those residents in that city. And these are some kind of, I think, operational challenges that will come on.
Yeah, I think that's pretty context specific, like depending on the street network in a particular place. But it comes back to the idea, this isn't a proposal for arterials and other like major streets that carry lots of traffic. This is at the kind of neighborhood scale where like none of the streets really carry much traffic. So you can probably narrow all of them, to be honest. And okay, it might slow people down, but we pay good money for traffic calming right now to slow people down. And so it could be, in many cases, there may not be an obstacle to doing all of them, or maybe some streets you keep the sidewalk and they're like separated from the roadway, and the other streets you have the shared space. But I think it's hard to generalize about that.
Sorry, last one.
Yes.
Thank you. If I can address a premise you shared earlier in your presentation, how do the main factors that influence housing prices, like within cities, but also inside cities? Is there a way of understanding that the relationship systematically in cities between minimum housing, minimum width of streets, and housing prices and costs, so that that might help policymakers in the future at least in housing projects?
Yeah, it would be a really interesting exercise to kind of think about like how much this could change housing prices. And I think it's hard to do empirically because like, we don't have places that have really narrow streets in the US. Like we have like everything's 40 or 50 or 60 feet wide. So we don't have that variation that would allow us to study it. But also because the housing prices are really determined by kind of a region-wide, like a regional housing market level. And so that if you narrow some streets in one place, it might increase the supply, but it's not going to increase the supply by enough to like make a dent really in the region-wide supply. And I think some people have tried to do hedonic pricing models where they've like looked at, hey, how much does street width, actually most of them don't even put street width in as a variable because there's no variation in street width. But where they have, I think it's, they have shown that it's actually increased, narrower streets have actually increased housing prices. That's really saying more about the kind of disamenity of having speeding traffic right outside your door and the safety, rather than the kind of the supply effect that you could have by building more housing. So yeah, that's a long way of saying I don't know, but it's a great question.
Well, speaking of questions, thank you for posing a really provocative question and triggering a whole bunch more questions.
Yeah.
So, lots to think about, and it's stuff we need to be thinking about, right?
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, so thanks so much for